All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Traditional Right Live. I believe this is episode 12. Back after a few weeks hiatus. In just a moment, I got to mute the video. There we go. I could hear myself talking. Anyway, I'm here. I'm Brent. I'm here with John and William S. Lind. How are you tonight, fellas?
We're doing well, thank you, in a cold but dry Cleveland.
Now, Bill, you were adding a new boiler to your house or something. You weren't getting enough steam pressure. How's that going now?
That is going well. I think we're already seeing better quality as a result of the higher steam pressure. The difference engine required for all of this, of course, stretches through miles of gear yardage, but that's a minor problem. We have plenty of minions to keep them all greased and oiled. So it's all working. And by the way, the difference engine really existed in the 19th century, invented by a man named Babbage. And there's a wonderful novel called The Difference Engine, in which our home computers are steam powered with exactly what we have here, a little tube to carry the exhaust out under the window.
The Chinamen are feeding the boiler as we speak.
Yes, exactly.
So while the men were installing the boiler, did you happen to get out at all, Bill?
I did indeed. I spent 3 very pleasant weeks in our neighbor, the Confederate States, where I am happy to report that Lent has been outlawed. It's the Baptist influence. And this was very convenient in the land of barbecue. Now I am back in Cleveland and is back to a diet of sackcloth and ashes. But it was a lovely time. While Cleveland was 10 degrees, I was getting a suntan in the Florida Keys. And also, my trip was something of a pilgrimage in search of Henry M. Flagler. Flagler was one of the 19th century industrialists who built this country, now called the robber barons, but in fact, again, they're the people who created modern America. And he got his start here in Cleveland as an early partner of another Clevelander, John D. Rockefeller, who grew up only a couple yards, John, from a couple miles from where we are right now in Strongsville, in the now vanished town of Albion. Anyway, Flagler became, needless to say, very wealthy through Standard Oil, started taking his wife to St. Augustine in Florida in the 1880s for her health in the winter. And there was nothing south of St. Augustine in Florida until you got to Key West. Well, he decided to change that. Flagler created Florida, at least the East Coast. He built the Florida East Coast Railroad. That created Miami. That created Palm Beach. He built the original Breakers Hotel. The hotel he built in St. Augustine is now part of Flagler College. It was the Ponce de Leon. If you ever get anywhere near St. Augustine, go and see it. It is spectacular. This was built in the 1880s for the richest of the rich. The lobby is a rotunda, and the murals are so spectacular, they hired the artist to duplicate them for the Library of Congress.
Okay.
And in the dining room, the windows are all Tiffany glass. When these guys did something, they did it right. And
spared no expense.
Went to the Presbyterian Church, which was high Presbyterian. I didn't even know there was such a thing, but there is. And with an organ of 5,000 plus pipes, it was a notable service. Both John Knox and John Calvin were rotating at least 5,000 RPM in their graves, and the service that included an introit chanted plain song a cappella.
Oh, geez.
Yes, but
what a waste of such an instrument.
It was St. Augustine is very much worth seeing, even if it's just for those two things. But he built the Florida East Coast Railroad. We sort of followed it south. And we got to South Florida. And in the early 20th century, he built the railroad over the sea. He built a railroad all the way to Key West. The bridges are still standing. They're restoring them for a bike trail. It was the railroad across the sea. It includes 7 Mile Bridge.
Wow.
And this is classic of, again, of the men who built this country. There were no focus groups. There were no consultants. The story goes, at least, that he sent his chief engineer down there to see if it could be built. And when he returned, Flagler said, I have only one question. Can it be built? The engineer replied, it can be built. Flagler said, then build it.
Wow.
That's how we did things. And needless to say, we can't do that. He was actually, yeah, he wasn't the nicest guy, but at the same time, he was a very good and sincere Christian who helped a lot of people in a lot of institutions, as most of these guys were, including, of course, Rockefeller himself. So that was an interesting part of the trip, but I also, it was interesting politically. Everywhere I went, I found that, and it was largely in areas where the Trump base is located, that support for President Trump is growing stronger, not weaker, among his base. With the moderates, I don't know. But the base is responding to these incessant attacks on him by an establishment they despise, because they know it despises them, by supporting him ever more strongly. And it could get entirely too interesting if in 2020, and I don't expect this to happen, but should the hard left take power in 2020, these people aren't going to roll over for what's going to come out of Washington. And at that point, it could get all too interesting.
Yeah.
But actually, I found a piece in today's New York Times, a piece about Britain, the Dreams of Brexit Britain, by James Mead, about a fellow who's gone around Britain recently talking to people who favor Brexit. Of course, he's coming from the left. He's writing for the New York Times. But he was looking for reasons for this, and he came up with three, and I think these are very similar to what I was seeing among Trump supporters in the South on this trip. He said one of the factors was a strong sense of oppression, of being censored and attending resentment. There were several occasions when leavers, people who want Brexit, I spoke to, left pregnant gaps that could only have been filled with anti-immigrant sentiments they weren't allowed to say. This is the growing resentment and beyond resentment, real anger at political correctness, at the ideology that demands that we constantly mouth lies like there are no differences between men and women, there are no differences between races or ethnic groups, homosexuality is perfectly normal, all of the rest of it. Everybody knows these rules. They can't, to use Dr. Johnson's favorite phrase. But the Brexiteers in Britain, that's part of their motivation. It's very clearly part of the motivation here for President Trump's support. So another thing I noticed was the internationalism of leavers, internationalism with a particular flavor. What he talks about is the way 50s, certainly up to the 60s into the 70s, if you were British, anywhere you went in the world, the fact that you were British put you on a higher level.
Sure.
I remember the 1960s comedy, No Sex Please, We're British. And it reflected that British sense of superiority, that walls begin at Calais. And I think Americans remember this too. We remember when anywhere in the world saying you were an American immediately brought a very positive attention. A friend of mine whose father was diplomatic service said when he was growing up, American embassies in every country in the world were the most popular places in town. The thought of them being threatened was unimaginable. They were completely open to the public, and everybody loved the Americans, loved what our country stood for. And of course, this was the heritage that we had developed over a couple centuries of relating to the rest of the world, not as a great power, but through trade and force of example. And it was in the 20th century, of course, we abandoned that strategy and decided to play the role of great power, for which we're now paying the penalty. And the third thing was a preoccupation with the state as defender of its people. Now, here's the left's mindset. Imagine thinking of the state as the defender.
How oppressive.
Yes, absolutely. Shocking that anyone would have such a notion.
The fundamental reason the state even exists.
Yes, that is the reason the state arose. It's the reason it exists. But they know governments, this is the feeling, British government's job to defend foreign competition, greedy capitalists, and through the National Health Service illness. Well, yes.
It's like, wait a second, 100 years ago, we were in possession of a quarter of the world, and now we live on an island the size of Michigan. What happened here?
And the British Empire now consists of Gibraltar, the Falklands, and I think Bermuda is still part of it.
Okay.
And that's about it.
Yeah, right.
We're seeing the same phenomenon once again here. If you're an average American who works for a living, etc., your government isn't doing anything for you. You suddenly feel like a foreigner in your own country.
Alienated. Mm-hmm.
You're alienated, and you're getting madder and madder about it. Which is why I think, regardless of what happens to President Trump in 2020, and I'm not sure he'll even run, but he has. I'm not certain he's going to run. If it's no longer fun, I'm not sure he's going to do it. But he has broken a path that other, frankly, more serious people will follow, because he's shown that you can win against the establishment.
Do you think one of the big reasons he's been able to survive is the fact that he can't be litigated out of existence?
Well, they're certainly trying.
Right. Oh, yeah. The Mueller probe, for example.
And there are constitutional questions as to whether he can be indicted or not while he's a sitting president. I think the answer is clearly no.
Right.
But they're nonetheless going to do everything in their power to try to get him on some kind of charges.
For sure.
Which may encourage him to run again just to give himself another 4 years. Yes. Right. So these all tally, these observations about Brexiters in Britain all tally with what I was hearing from Trump supporters throughout the South.
Interesting.
So I think these are factors that are becoming operative in more and more Western countries. And of course, they're the only hope if the West is to have a future, because otherwise we are just going to be engulfed in a sea of immigrants, and particularly in the case of Europe, Islamic immigrants. Which brings us, Brent, to our big topic of the day, which is the shootings in New Zealand.
Well, yeah, before we get into that, I just want to make a couple quick comments. One, I'm actually surprised that you're seeing more support for Trump. I feel like, if anything, he's kind of given up on his base. It seems like he wants to be the president of Israel more than he wants to be the president of the United States.
Remember, a lot of the base is Christian evangelical, who themselves feel a connection to Israel. Now, I would argue that that's not very good theology, but it's a very real factor among evangelicals. And the South, of course, is heavily evangelical.
And Representative Omar coming out completely against the dual citizenship and a lot of the issues with that, which unfortunately I have to agree with, but it's very, very unattractive to the financiers that are involved with AIPAC, involved with the money and interest with, Israeli lobbies and things like that. But that could help. That would help Trump in 2020.
It could. I don't see the Israel issue as being a popular issue. I see it as being an inside the elite issue, because let's face it, it's primarily a money issue. Mm-hmm. And from that standpoint, it's an inside the beltway issue. It's a matter of your own funding if you're a candidate, and also what funding goes to your opponent.
Sure.
So that is essentially what drives Israeli policy within the beltway. Outside the beltway, I think you have a general popular support in this country still for Israel, although more and more American Jews are very unhappy with Netanyahu and the Likud policies. Yeah. Right. So Israel, there is a ever wider gap between American Jews and Israel.
Right.
But in the countryside among the populists, I think the overriding element is this evangelical belief that somehow the current state of Israel is part of the prophetic end times, which, by the way, Orthodox Jews themselves reject. They say, no, that doesn't work that way. Right. And I think that theologically they're correct. But that is a very real factor out there, Brent.
So how can we possibly have an America first foreign policy if we've got this huge segment of our population that is fixated on Israel? We can't.
Well, Israel, to a certain degree, for a long time, and this was long before Likud turned over, this goes back virtually to the founding of Israel, has sort of been a quasi-51st state.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yes. It's strategically, it is not to our advantage, obviously. Remember, strategy is based on interests, not on sentiments. But it is nonetheless a political fact. So I think we just have to look at Israel as being, again, not from your perspective or mine necessarily as a strategist, but from the perspective of the average American. There is the sort of special relationship with Israel that we earlier had with Britain, which got us, unfortunately, involved in 2 world wars. The first of which we could have avoided easily and should have avoided, and the world would have had a better 20th century if we had. But particularly the East Coast elite had this special emotional relationship beyond the very strong financial relationship. They'd invested heavily in allied, particularly British war bonds. But they also had this strong emotional attachment to Britain. It was not to our, this is also not to our strategic advantage, but it's a political fact of life.
It's the way it is.
Yeah.
And the last comment that I wanted to make was just I really, really, really like St. Augustine. I think the old town is beautiful, even if it's been kind of overtaken with tourist shops and whatnot. But I think that the architecture is still really amazing, and you can easily imagine what it was like 400 years ago.
That's true of the Spanish part of town.
Yeah.
It's another part of town tourists generally don't see that's equally good. It's block after block of very fine Victorian and Queen Anne houses. And that, to me, was at least as interesting as the Spanish town, partly because, of course, at this time of the year, the Spanish town was overrun with tourists, including, of course, myself. But the residential streets, no, you don't see tourists back there. And it's just block after block of terrific houses. The same is true of Key West, by the way. There are a couple tourist streets, the harbor front, and one kind of raunchy street. I forget the name of it. That's New Orleans in style, which is to say it needs a good fire hose cleaning. But there are block after block of beautiful houses, Greek Revival and Victorian particularly. So both of those places are architectural gems in ways most tourists aren't even aware of. But I'm glad you also liked St. Augustine. If I were to get a Florida condo for the winter, it would either be in St. Augustine or Key West. And St. Augustine's a whole lot more affordable.
Yeah, for sure. For our listeners, if you want to participate in the show, we can read questions and comments live. You can put them in the live chat here if you're listening live, or send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. And we'll read it live and address it. So, and we enjoy having audience participation. As far as the news, obviously, the big news is the shooting in New Zealand. I'm sure everybody knows what happened, unless you've been living under a rock. I think it was Friday morning that it happened. 49 people were killed in a shooting across 2 different mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand.
I guess it was 50 now. They escalated it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the guy that carried out the shooting allegedly was kind of steeped in online right-wing culture, but then there's a lot of other aspects to his situation that are kind of developing right now. The details are all trickling out. So he had an interesting travel history leading up to the shooting. He's originally from Australia, was living in New Zealand, I guess, but before carrying out the shooting. He was in Turkey. He was in Pakistan. He had a Facebook post saying how beautiful Pakistan was, how great the people were, and how much he liked being there. And then he was supposedly also in North Korea. So, Bill, what's your kind of initial reaction to this situation?
Well, first of all, as you've said, there is much that remains unknown. Of course, the media, the establishment media, rushing to judgment, say, "Oh, this is right-wing hate," etc. They're always going to do that. But the fact is, we don't know a lot of things yet. The fact he'd been in Pakistan, I think, is especially interesting. I believe the people in the mosques were Shiites. Brent, have you gotten any?
That's what I heard.
Okay, I don't know for sure that's the case. But of course, Pakistan is overwhelmingly Sunni, and it is also a place where these kinds of massacres occur all the time. Sunnis killing Shiites. And the same is true, of course, in Afghanistan and throughout much of the Arab world. There's a civil war underway. We turned it on again, in effect, by our invasion of Iraq, that threw the Sunnis out of governing Iraq and replaced them with Shiites. And that has turned the long, simmering Sunni-Shiite conflict into open war. So I am not 100% sure that what we're seeing on the surface here as to his motivation will prove in the end to be correct. I think that, especially if he really liked Pakistan and the people and so forth, it is possible, I'll only say possible, with no idea at this point, that this was actually part of the Sunni-Shiite war. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Again, all of this at this point is unknown, and it's all just being swept up. Everything's being swept up in this screaming about right-wing hate. But if, in fact, he was, for example, had converted to Sunni Islam in Pakistan, it would make sense in many ways for him to try to blame this on the right. Because, of course, who's leading the opposition to Islam in the Western countries? Obviously, it's the right. So if it's a chance to discredit the right, that makes sense from an Islamic perspective. Is that the situation? Again, I do not know. I am not jumping to conclusions. I'm only saying, let's wait before we conclude anything here. The second thing that immediately jumped out, Brent, at you and at me, and I'm sure at John and many other people, is why in the hell are there mosques in New Zealand to begin with? This is an absurdity. That's the real problem. Like, why are there mosques in England? Why are there mosques in Germany and Austria and in the United States? These are not Islamic parts of the world. Does that mean that no Islamic should be allowed to come here? Well, maybe it does. But even if they're allowed to come here, that's very different from being allowed to build mosques. I'm often in favor of letting them build a mosque here when we can build a cathedral in Riyadh.
Yeah, so hold your breath.
There are no churches in Saudi Arabia, and throughout the Islamic lands, Christians and those of any other religions, Zoroastrians, Hindus, etc., are constantly and violently persecuted. Mm-hmm. Look at the Copts in Egypt, which is an Egyptian Christian church. The Coptic church is a very ancient church. It's about 10% of the Egyptian population still, despite constant persecution, church bombings, mass murders. Those get a paragraph or two in the same papers that splash this across the headline on the front page with the biggest type. So the Islamics see it as a one-way game, because in Islam, you cannot convert from Islam. Even if your conversion is forced to Islam, if you leave Islam, you're under automatic sentence of death. The reality is that so long as Islam accepts forced conversion and forced adherence, it is not compatible with any other religion or with secular society. There's one exception to that, and that's the Sufis, who are nonviolent. They're focused inward on their own mystical experience, and they are violently persecuted by both the Shiites and the Sunnis. So, again, the overall question, why were there mosques in New Zealand, these people there? Um,
One of the best comments I saw was, what do you think would be the world reaction if 49 Christians were killed in a city called Muhammad Mosque in the Middle East? There would be no reaction.
There would be no reaction. And by the way, this is happening all the time in Africa. Christians are being killed frequently. It's real war with Islam in Africa. We have had Christians worshiping on a Sunday morning. Suddenly the doors of their church are barred and it's set on fire by Muslims. These don't even make the New York Times. Remember, the Times' real slogan is all the news that fits, we print. And so this fit their narrative of evil Christianity, evil white males, evil right wing, etc. The mass murder of Christians by Islamics doesn't fit the narrative, so hey, doesn't exist. And this, by the way, is exactly what the president and his supporters mean by fake news.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's a lot more that we can say about that, because it is still kind of a developing situation. It seems like there are other fishy aspects to the whole thing.
Yeah,
but
there were 3 other people arrested, and all you see anything about is the one guy being a lone, fanatic.
Again, there is much yet unknown, but there are a couple other things we can say at this point, Brett. When I stand back and look at this from the perspective of fourth generation war, this seems, from what we know now, to be an act in that war, if the current narrative holds up. And here we see how fourth generation war is creating the leaderless resistance that is one of fourth generation war's strengths, and therefore one of the biggest dangers from this perspective of any state. What states focus on for security against extremists of every variety is their ability to penetrate plots. That you have a group who have to plot, they have to organize, they have to get weapons, they have to communicate, and they can be infiltrated by agents, their communications can be intercepted, etc. That's what DHS and its equivalent in countries all over the world are doing. When you're dealing with leaderless resistance, you can't do that. It doesn't work. And leaderless resistance occurs when, through the internet, an individual is inspired to act alone. And by the way, ISIS is making heavy use of this, particularly in Western Europe. It's saying, we're not going to come and organize something for you. We're giving you a general order, go out and kill white Christian Europeans. And it motivates these people to act alone. And as we see, particularly in this case, the individuals are using the internet to then magnify what they're doing and to spread this notion of leaderless resistance. Supposedly, from what we're being told now, we're inspired by this guy's reaction to seeing Islamics all over France. Well, that's an understandable reaction. Much of France isn't France anymore. You suddenly find yourself in North Africa. Yeah. And a very hostile North Africa, by the way, if you're white and Christian. And whether that proves to be his motivation or not, in the end, the phenomenon we're seeing here of one of these things inspiring more, and we're seeing it not just obviously on the right, we're seeing this again within Islam. This is ISIS's current strategy. We're seeing it on the left. We're seeing it in all. It's built into the internet. The internet is the sorcerer's apprentice. It takes one thing and then magnifies it and repeats it over and over and over and over again, just as the images themselves repeat over and over again. And I think this is actually going to be a growing part of fourth generation war, which is bad news, because what it portends ultimately is anarchy. And the state is much less able to defeat leaderless resistance than it is plots, because there's nothing to intercept. You're talking about somebody's brainwaves. And then finally, speaking to our colleagues on the right, if it turns out in the end this was an action from the right, it's important to understand why actions like this actually work against us. Gramsci, one of the founders of cultural Marxism, along with Gerd Lukács, this was in 1919, Italian Antonio Gramsci, communist, said that with this new Marxism he was trying to give birth to, what we know as cultural Marxism or political correctness, said it cannot be stopped by force. The reason is that all Marxism preaches the cult of the victim. Marxism of every variety, whether it's the cultural Marxism, the old economic Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, take your pick, all Marxism is loser worship. It's if you're successful, if you're a builder, if you're a producer, if you're out there doing great things, you're evil. You're a capitalist, you're a member of the bourgeoisie, you're an exploiter, you're a landlord, etc. You deserve a firing squad or the gulag. If you're a complete loser who produces nothing, you're only a taker, you're always defeated, then you're a moral hero. And in the climate that we now live in, where cultural Marxism sets the tone throughout much of the world, the highest status you can achieve is victim.
Victim Olympics.
Exactly. And Martin van Crefeld calls this the power of weakness. And it's John Boyd's moral level of war. So if, again, big if, this guy is in fact coming from the right, this is not a victory for the right. This is a huge defeat for the right because it's a defeat at the moral level. 50 more or fewer Islamics in the world isn't even an atom in a drop.
No, yeah, it's...
But... and it's not going to discourage other Islamics from coming to New Zealand. I'm sure the New Zealand government will now probably subsidize more of them coming there.
Right, right.
But on the moral level of war, this is a disaster.
The last thing I'll say in regards to this, if it is what they're saying it is on its face, that it's coming from the right, I think that it's likely that we will see a lot more of this. Because there are so many lost young men that feel like they have no future. We're not allowed to have our own spaces anymore as like white Christian European people, without having to have without foreigners coming in here. We can't have a foreign policy that's for us. We can't stop bombing the Middle East. We can't speak out against any of this without censorship or losing your job or something. And it's driving people mad. And of course, it's not a good thing that somebody goes and shoots up a mosque. It's not good strategically, and it's not good morally, but I think that it's likely going to happen more.
I'm afraid you're right. And again, we have to understand that every time it does happen, it's likely to be a defeat for us, not a victory. And that's, you have a situation where I can understand what you're saying, Brent, and I think you're correct. It's very much, again, similar to what this fellow in the Times is talking about, the Brits who favored Brexit. This feeling of oppression where you can't say what you think about anything because certain viewpoints have effectively been outlawed. But it nonetheless is strategically disastrous to fight this stuff with violence.
Yeah, in today's political discourse, this definitely seems like it would be a mistake. But do you think there's any value in, I guess, if we take everything that he said, even in his manifesto, his 80-page manifesto, as exactly what he wrote. His main intro is that I did this because of all of this unvetted immigration that they're forcing upon Western countries, European nations, like you mentioned, France, that he visited. I think there's a general sense that we can all agree, was this a terrible act? Yes. But under the surface, it's almost kind of like a martyrdom where, look, we're seeing problems that are being addressed by acts of violence, but we kind of agree with maybe the reasons why they were done.
Yes, again, there's no reason there should be Muslims in New Zealand.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting we don't fight that. I would be strongly in favor, frankly, in this country, of a constitutional amendment. Unless Islam gives up forced conversion and forced adherence, a constitutional amendment prohibiting the profession, practice, or preaching of the Islamic religion in the United States. For the same reason I would favor banning the Aztec religion with its demand for a constant, well, a constant supply of beating human hearts to offer to Huitzilopochtli. It is a violent religion. Mm-hmm. And until it gives that up, it is not compatible with other religions or with secular society. These are facts.
Right.
But we're told we may not say these things.
Correct.
But I think Brent is talking about something more fundamental. Brent's talking about simply that more and more men, young men particularly, and this, by the way, Brent, is happening in many parts of the world, are finding themselves with no prospects. If in this country they're white Christian men, heterosexual, they are considered somehow evil. Again, they're the old equivalent of the capitalists and landlords under the old economic Marxism. They're inherently evil. And they can't do anything without women, but they can't do anything with women because if they displease a woman, she can immediately claim sexual harassment and he's guilty until proven innocent. And the rage is just building and building and building. And because of the way the internet fosters leaderless resistance, I'm afraid you're right, Brent. We are going to see more of this. But on our side, we need to understand it is strategically disastrous.
Yeah. So,
my final topic, by the way, is Korea, where once again, as I wrote in the last issue of the American Conservative, President Trump has been sabotaged by his own administration, and it appears that the moves he initiated to end the long-standing Korean confrontation have been defeated by the neocons. North Korea was absolutely right when it came out recently and said that Kim and President Trump have a good relation still, but Pompeo and Bolton have sabotaged this to the point where no deal is possible. And of course, that's intentional on their part. The war machine in Washington that needs these confrontations to justify its budgets, of course, wants that to continue, even though there's a risk increasingly of nuclear war. And if we lose, say, San Diego someday, it's not going to be just a minor blip. But the fact of the matter is that the president sits there and lets his own people sabotage him and does nothing about it. And that is not competent on the part of a president. So I said in TAC, no other president would have done this. No other president would have allowed this kind of sabotage by his own people. And it's a real shame because I think the president and Kim had a real chance to work out a peace deal. What Pompeo and Bolton have demanded, and what the president has ceded to, because the whole establishment before the second meeting with Kim say, oh, he's going to give away the store. Oh, he's going to get taken to the cleaners. Oh, he's going to do things like agree to a peace treaty. Well, why the hell not agree to a peace treaty?
Why is this so bad?
Yeah, do we want to resume fighting in Korea? And it buffaloed him to the point where he insisted that North Korea completely denuclearize before it gets any relief from sanctions. Well, that's asking for unconditional surrender. The Kim government can't do that and survive. It would delegitimize the Kim government. It would be an enormous humiliation. It can't do that. And of course, Pompeo and Bolton and the neocons know it can't do that, which is why they're insisting there be no staged arrangement where they take certain steps and we take certain steps in parallel. Which is the only way you could possibly come out of this with a deal. So yes, President Trump is not directly the one to blame for this failure, but indirectly it's his fault because he keeps these people employed as they undermine everything he tries to do there, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so forth.
I'm going to take the glass half full type perspective on this. 2 years ago, it was basically a foregone conclusion that we might be at war with North Korea. I might be fighting in some rice paddies somewhere if it weren't for Trump. I'm impressed with the fact that he at least came to the table and got them negotiated. Now, as far as his cabinet sabotaging him at every turn, absolutely, it's been a problem. His Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, did the same thing by recusing himself during the Mueller investigation, completely screwing over Trump. Trump was like, hey, it'd have been nice to know if you're going to do that before I made you Attorney General. So yeah, the influence within his cabinet hasn't exactly helped him out, though. for sure, as far as the long-term goals go, as far as coming to a peace treaty.
As I said in my piece in TAC, history's verdict on President Trump at this point will be that he wanted to be an anti-establishment president, but didn't know how.
He can't. There's nothing really you can do.
Well, you can. You don't have to recruit your people from inside the Beltline. It's harder to recruit them from outside, but there are people who can be identified, and I'm of course talking about conservatives here, by what they've written. You know where a guy's coming from by reading what he's written. I think of people like Andrew Bacevich, who writes regularly for the American Conservative, who's terrific on foreign policy issues and understands very well, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who lost a son over there. He understands very well why we should not be in these parts of the world.
Sure.
There's a long list of those people. State think tanks, conservative think tanks, unlike the ones in Washington, are not all whorehouses. They actually produce some very good work. They have people who really want to solve problems, not just raise funds off of them, and come up with some good, imaginative, potentially effective stuff. You can turn to those. It's not as easy as turning to the inside crowd in Washington, but if you turn to the inside crowd, you get if you're an anti-establishment president, you get exactly what President Trump's gotten. An administration full of people out to sabotage you.
Well, I think he tried to get some people originally, and who was the original Secretary of Defense he had? The one guy that was, it was litigated at first. He was, during the campaign, he was with him. I can't remember his name. You know who I'm talking about?
Yes. Well, are you talking about, is it General?
General, yeah.
Yes.
I cannot remember his name.
I can't remember names at all anymore when I watch
But
it.
they basically found something that it was, a process crime that he did that they basically ruined his life over. I think that's what happens when you try to get people from outside the system, is they'll just litigate you to death.
What they try to do. And in his case, it's particularly interesting because while he was still in the Army in a senior intelligence position,
You can't remember his name for the life of me.
I can't remember anyone's name anymore until 3 a.m. But he testified to Congress that our problem is that we're fighting fourth generation wars and we have a second generation military, which means he's one of the very, very few people inside who gets it.
Sure.
So they had to get him out.
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's a huge threat to the budget if you don't want to buy all this crap for second generation war.
Right.
So, if we don't have anything else to add, we do have a few emails that we can address. Yes? No?
Yes?
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. We were just sitting waiting for the emails.
We were waiting.
Yes.
Okay. Pulling it up. All right. So, I have two emails. They're a little long, so I'll just kind of summarize here. This one is from JDR456. He's got a question. It says, what would be the policy of the Western world with regards to neo-imperial China, a less pacifist Japan, a more militant India, a more Islamized Middle East, etc.? And this is in the context of a Western world with waning power and influence.
Well, if we're smart, when we're talking about Japan, China, India, etc., we will see all of these countries as potential allies, not as opponents. And specifically as allies in the quest to preserve the state system in the 21st century in the face of fourth generation war. I think the Islamic areas that our caller mentions are likely to be more and more chaotic, more and more state failure, which means they also become gigantic factories of refugees. That may occur in India as well. I think the whole Southern Hemisphere is going to be in trouble. Climate change from, in many cases, huge populations of young men with no prospects and nothing to do but fight. So, of course, they're going to fight. And with state collapse. So, in the face of this, what we need is, instead of seeing a resurgent China, resurgent Japan, etc., as potential enemies, we need to be pulling them into an alliance of all states in defense of the state system itself. And as I've said before, that alliance has to start with the three great powers, the United States, Russia, and China. The problem is that the Washington establishment wants conflict with Russia and China to justify the budget. It's absurd. We're not going to fight them. They're nuclear powers. But it's a game that they can play and pull the wool over the eyes of the American people and say, oh, yes, we have to keep spending $1 trillion a year because we may have to go to war with Russia and China, when in fact we need them as our allies.
Yeah, Google's heavily invested in the Chinese military recently, we found out.
If as China resumes its historic place as one of the world's great powers, for much of world history, the greatest world power, it is going to be able to and be wanting to expand the areas at its peripheries where it maintains stability. We should welcome that. That is not a threat to us. If the yellow man wishes to increasingly pick up the white man's burden, we should welcome that. China does not want instability. It does not want disorder around it. We shouldn't want instability or disorder around it either. China needs safety of the sea lane. She's much more dependent at this point on both food and energy imports by sea than we are. We should welcome China to play an increasing role in keeping the sea lane safe. And in fact, the Chinese have been participating in the anti-piracy patrols off of East Africa. So I think we're locked into an outdated paradigm, a paradigm where we see the world in terms always of competition between nation states. We aren't seeing that the state system itself, the whole concept of the nation state, is in peril. And we need to adjust our grand strategic concept soon, or the state system itself, including us, are going to be in grave danger.
If we can get them to pick up our what we started in the Middle East, I think that I'd be happy to hand them the keys to primary world power.
They can have as much of Afghanistan as they want for as long as they want.
All right, our next email is from a guy named Benjamin. He's an International Guard chaplain. He's got a nice long email here, and he makes some comments about Soviet-style propaganda and subversion in America. He's got a question that says, how specifically can 4GW concepts be applied to applied by non-state entities to successfully counter the socialist subversion effort?
Well, we're seeing, of course, fourth generation entities that are very anti-socialist. We're seeing it in the form of some gangs, particularly in Latin America and Central America. Some of those are politically actually on the right. We're seeing it, of course, with some of the Islamic non-state organizations, which have their own concept of Islamic economics, but they're very anti-Marxist, obviously. They are primarily a threat to socialism and Marxism at the moral level because they're offering an alternate loyalty. The problem from our perspective is that alternate loyalty may be even more dangerous to us than Marxism, which, after all, the Soviet Union did collapse because of the inherent flaws in Marxism. I think the cultural Marxism in the West is now beginning to do the same thing. It's overreaching badly, and I think it's actually in serious trouble, largely because it's overreached. I'm less worried in the future about Marxism of any variety or socialism than I am about the fourth generation entities themselves. So the fact that they provide alternative primary loyalties to socialism is not necessarily a good thing, especially when we're talking about religions like Islam, where the primary loyalty means you fight. Primary loyalty to socialism doesn't necessarily mean you go out killing people. But in the case of Islam, commandments if you're an Islamic male. And that, I would argue, is probably more dangerous to us than socialism. So I'm not sure I want to see a triumph of fourth generation entities over socialism. I would rather see something else. In our case, traditional Western culture triumph over both.
Fortunately, I think the greatest enemy of socialism, Marxism, cultural Marxism is truth. So we have
Yes.
that on our side as well.
That, and again, these people are overreaching. You just look at the university campuses.
Oh,
I mean, it's become absurd. Safe spaces with teddy bears I mean, they're turning them into nurseries.
Did you see the admissions scandal that was recently exposed? Yeah.
The only question is why anybody would pay a dime to get into most of these places, because the education is crap.
Yeah.
No, the only question is, why is anybody surprised? I thought that was the foregone conclusion. Like, yeah, of course, people, slip a little money under the table and they get in.
Yeah,
I mean, I didn't think that Yale or Harvard really had that much, weight behind it anymore, because people know this sort of thing's going on.
It's the left thinks that it can do all of this nonsense on campus, and the rest of the country won't see it, but the rest of the country does see it. And the rest of the country knows that's what they want to do in the country as a whole. And so I think, again, they've overreached. They've actually reached and passed their culminating point. And like Marxism, Leninism, cultural Marxism is going to collapse. And the more we have these little girls like the congresswoman from New York and the one from Detroit appearing as their spokesman, the better for us.
Right.
It's becoming the cultural Marxists are becoming a self-parody.
We got one last question. This is from John Best in the live chat. It says, question for Mr. Lind, how will fourth generation naval warfare be conducted? And what is the difference between second and third generation naval warfare? Thanks.
Well, so to take the second part first, there's a wonderful book on that, which I recommend strongly. Best naval history in the last 3 or 4 decades. The rules of the game. And the author's name will pop into my head at some point. It is in the second half of the 18th century, the Royal Navy, well before the Prussian Army, developed maneuver warfare and institutionalized successfully, which was one of the main reasons why the British were so superior to the French at sea in the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars. Remember, the French Navy had been equal qualitative to the British Navy at the time of the American Revolution, or we would still be British colonies. But you had this enormous cultural shift in the Royal Navy in the second half of the 18th century. Andrew Gordon is the author of The Rules of the Game. His book is about how and why the Royal Navy lost it again and reverted to the second generation in the 19th century. And at the core of this, signaling. They developed, with Sir Honpopham's signal book of 1819, they created the illusion that the admiral could control every movement of every ship in his fleet all the time. And that killed all initiative. So actually, I had lunch with Gordon at the Royal Navy's Maritime Warfare Center outside Portsmouth, which is the old D-Day situation, D-Day headquarters, with the situation map still on the walls. And he was lecturing in the morning, I was lecturing in the afternoon. And I told him, I want to write the prequel to your book on how the Royal Navy developed this in the 18th century. So the problem is they weren't writing it down. And the historian is restricted to his sources. In terms of fourth generation war at sea, it will be done by things that don't look like warships. For example, if I were a fourth generation entity operating where the United States was an enemy or potential enemy in the Persian Gulf, my weapon of choice would be the torpedo dhow. It would be a dhow that looks like every other dhow that carries one torpedo. We saw in the attack on the USS Cole, a classic example of fourth generation naval warfare. I would go directly after the merchant ships. I would find ways to sneak bombs on board them. I would, again, suicide boats. The suicide attack is now a major element in much fourth generation war. I would try to take, as always, any state force from within. Through money, through suborning, through working my own people into the organization, so that I know what they're doing before they even know it. I get inside their loop that way. But the fourth generation entities can't have aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. It's an impossibility for them. But as we've seen on land, they will find other ways to fight. And in terms of your question, the difference between second and third generation naval warfare, the one is attritional and centrally controlled, and the other is highly decentralized and opportunistic and looking for a decisive result. Gordon's book starts beautifully illustrating this difference when he talks about one of the British dreadnoughts at Jutland. When the Germans do the Gefechtskepplung, it had something that was thought to be impossible, turning with the lead ship like this, becoming the U, 180 degrees simultaneously. And so the Germans are getting away. The British are in rigid line ahead. They've now lost their 18th century sense of warfare completely. And a lieutenant on the bridge of one of the British dreadnoughts says to the captain, "Sir, if you will only turn toward the Germans, your name will be as famous as Nelson's." And the captain thought for a minute and said, "I must follow the ship ahead." That's the difference.
There you go. We've got a couple more questions here, actually. This is from Russell Snow. His first question says, will there be a naval conflict that the U.S. loses due to diversity? Can the Navy be saved?
Due to diversity?
Yeah.
Well, very possibly. But it's probably not going to be due to that only. Our warships today are extremely fragile. They have no armor. We've used lots of aluminum, which the British discovered in the Falklands is a real bad thing to do because aluminum burns. And essentially one hit on one of our modern warships, and you've got an incipient disaster. And this is not new historically, but what it's come down to over and over in history is damage control. The Japanese lost their best carrier of World War II, the Taiho, to one torpedo for an American submarine because they had terrible damage control. They lost the Shinano, the biggest carrier in the world, till after the war, the one built on the Yamato hull, to terrible damage control.
They had nobody on that ship, I think. There was like, yeah.
Well, they didn't have a regular crew yet,
right.
But there were a lot of people on board. But the problem is when one of our ships now, a mixed crew with a lot of women, takes a hit, it's going to be imperative that they act very quickly and effectively to deal with the hit before it costs them the ship. But the women are going to panic. And the men are going to forget about that to protect the women and get them off the ship. This is not just at sea, this is running through the whole military. I was talking to a young Air Force guy just back from Afghanistan, and he asked me what I thought about the problems with women in the military. And I said, well, they're twofold. First, the men don't cohere into a band of brothers. Instead, they're rivals for the favors of the women. And second, in combat, they will drop the mission to protect the women. And he said, I've seen both. And now imagine this on a ship where suddenly you've got a critical situation because you've taken a hit. There was actually a case of this I heard about not long ago. We had a fire on an aircraft carrier. Now fires on carriers are actually common, but this one got pretty serious. The women officers gathered in the quarter and cried while the men went to put the fire out and then came back to comfort the women. I was on a Navy ship with women officers. Supposedly they were officers anyway. It was a minor thing, but the wind changed and started to blow us into the dock. And the women saw it happening and stood there and did nothing. And finally, a couple male petty officers got some guys and they put some fenders over the side in time for when it hit the dock. The women did absolutely nothing. They were completely and utterly useless. And in combat, they become an encumbrance because the guys will put saving the women ahead of saving the ship.
Okay, well, that wraps up all our questions and emails, and I think all the news that we've got. Reminder, if you want to participate in the show, if you have questions or comments, what have you, you can put it in the live chat while we're live, and we'll read it on the air. And if you don't make the live chat, you can always send us an email, and we'll read those too. That's at traditionalright@gmail.com. John, Bill, do you have anything else to add tonight?
No, except once again on the New Zealand thing, do not rush to conclusions. There's much yet that's unknown.
Yeah, we'll see where we're at with that in a week. And so next Sunday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, that's our goal. Every-ish Sunday, we'll do these live streams and answer your questions and talk about the news. So John and Bill, thanks, and have a good night.
Thanks for listening.